Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and I'm here today at the Rock Island Auction Company taking a look at a pair of Untitled Model of 1878 military carbines. These are extremely rare models. Well, both of them are extremely rare models, this one particularly so. Now, a little bit of background. The Burgess system deserves a lot more exposure than it's actually gotten, I think. Andrew Burgess was a very talented inventor. He actually spent a lot of his time in the 1870s working on photography. He is apparently, probably, the guy who actually took the photograph of Abraham Lincoln that's on the $5 bill, which is kind of cool. He was also interested in firearms, but it wasn't until like the mid to late 1870s that he really started applying his talents to firearms design. So his first his first lever action rifle was the model of 1872. It was chambered for 44 Henry, and it was really sort of just dipping his toe in the water, so to speak. He would continue in 1875 with some refinements to the design and scaling it up. His 1875 rifle was designed around the 4570 government cartridge because he, at least, and certainly other people, realized that if there was ever going to be real military adoption in the United States of a lever-action rifle, it would have to be a rifle that was chambered for 4570. That was the standard government cartridge. They liked it, and they weren't about to trade down to a pistol caliber for a standard infantry weapon. So at that time, in 1875, there was no other lever-action rifle that was capable of handling 4570, and precious few repeating rifles of any kind that were capable of it. Winchester didn't have their own until 1876, and even then not really. We'll get to that in a moment. Burgess continued to work on his design, and in 1878 he finally had a finalized gun, this pattern, that was put into production by the Whitneyville Armory. Now, Whitneyville Armory was a company run by Eli Whitney, son, if I recall correctly, of the famous Eli Whitney's cotton gin, who you may recall from history class. And what Whitney did was basically take in submissions from independent entrepreneurial inventors. If you came up with an idea for a cool gun, but you didn't have the capital or the facilities to actually build it yourself, you could take it to Whitney, and in exchange for, well, you would get a royalty, and you would license your patent to him, and he would go ahead and produce the gun. And so he was open to working with a lot of different people. This was a good alternative for folks who weren't associated with one of the major companies like Colt or Winchester or Smith & Wesson. Burgess took advantage of this. Now, apparently there were some personal issues, personality-related issues, that got in the way of a good working relationship between Whitney and Burgess, but we'll leave those for a little bit down the road. Whitney launched the model of 1878 rifle in 4570, and it was really quite a good design, and it should have done quite well on the commercial market. It was introduced into the 1878 U.S. Army trials, which were looking for a magazine rifle in 4570, where unfortunately it didn't do so well. It had a number of problems. So let's take a closer look at these and talk about what those problems were and how they would ultimately impact the gun. Just to be clear here, I've got two versions. This is a first pattern military carbine. This is a third pattern, and that's the first and the last. So let's take a closer look. We have oh so much to cover here, so let's start with the basic mechanics. The Winchester, of course, has a toggle link, where when the lever's locked, the two toggle arms are solid and prevent the breech from opening. When you pull the lever down, those two arms fold together and allow the whole thing to cycle. What Burgess did that is different is he has a single, long, basically locking piece here, and this is going to rotate all the way up and find its way behind the breech face. So we have the breech face of the rifle here. This is just a dust cover, and when I close the lever, this is going to move forward, and then this locking bar is going to pivot up. Notice we have the firing pin here. This is what's going to actually firmly lock against the breech block. That's going to come up right there, and there's that firing pin again. So that acts as a single locking block behind the breech. It's a pretty strong system, and it allows the gun to successfully handle the recoil and the power of 4570. Now, the next thing to talk about is loading. This is a top-loading example of the gun, and as such, it's extremely rare. when the gun was released, it was available either as a top loader or a side loader with basically a Kingsgate style of loading mechanism there. And Burgess and Whitney apparently thought that the top loader would be a fairly popular option. Why? We don't know, because in reality, the top loader was completely unpopular. Nobody wanted this. Everybody wanted to be able to load the gun while keeping a round in the chamber, not having to open the entire action. It stays cleaner, it's always ready to fire. This was superior in everybody's mind. So a bunch of retailers had been sent top-loading versions of the gun. They were told, send them back, we'll replace them with side loaders for you, because those will actually sell. The ones that came back were pretty much all converted at the factory to use side gates. They very quickly stopped even making a top-loader only version, because by the way, you can load this one from the top as well. This works the same on both patterns. You open up the lever, and there's your lifter, and you can just drop cartridges right down in there. So this one gives you the flexibility to do it however you like. This one's just limited. Even the examples of top-loading guns that were sold into the private market, a lot of those were retroactively upgraded to have the side loading gate anyway by their later owners. So there are virtually none of these first pattern Burgess military carbines that are still existing with, without the side loading gate. All right, so I just said military carbine. These guns, the 1878 Burgess or Burgess Whitney-Morse, were sold in two main patterns. Either a military carbine, which is this. It has a saddle ring on the side. It has a military style tangent sight or notch sight there, calibrated for 100, 300, and 500 yards. And it is relatively short with a 22-inch barrel, a single barrel band and nose cap, and a magazine capacity of 7 rounds. That's the military carbine. Your other option was the sporting rifle version, which has a 28-inch barrel, a 9-round capacity, 2 barrel bands, and no saddle ring. So basically you get the long one or the short one. Now, this is a good time to mention the 1878 U.S. Army trial looking for a magazine-fed repeating rifle in 4570. The Burgess was submitted to that trial, as was a Winchester, specifically the Winchester Model of 1876. Now, if you're familiar with Winchesters, you may be thinking to yourself, but wait, the 1876 was not capable of handling 4570. It was too weak of a gun, and never offered for that reason. And you're right, Winchester made a couple of them in 4570 just for the trial, because that's what was required, and discovered that they were in fact not strong enough to handle the cartridge. The Winchester 1876 did not do well in the trial as a result. And you would think that this would really leave an opening for a stronger gun like the Burgess to do really well. And by the way, as a military carbine, this thing is really nice and handy. This is a great gun of its type. So what happened? Well, the problem was they submitted one of the side-loading guns, and the loading system had some problems. They hadn't really worked out that design fully, and it had a tendency, this is a third pattern gun, but it's got the gate, so we'll use it here anyway. It had a tendency to jam. So one round would come onto the lifter, and then a second round would jam itself under the lifter, and this caused serious and repetitive problems for the gun. Now, on the civilian side of things, this would continue to have an impact and work against Burgess. These guns were only made for less than 2 years, and the problem was they had finalized all of the production tooling before they got the results back from the military trials. And so they didn't have a chance to tweak and refine the design before they started shipping them to commercial clients. As a result, commercial clients got guns that tended to jam. Everyone wanted this side loading, but it didn't work quite all that well. In addition, cutting away space for this side loading gate required weakening the elevator mechanism in a way that wasn't necessary with the top loader. That caused additional problems, and they had serious issues with Remington Umc Ammunition, one of the major manufacturers, producing ammo that would explode in the tube magazine. The problem was Remington UMC used a round-nosed bullet design that was a little bit sort of vaguely pointy, and it used a very sensitive Berdan primer. And not just in the Burgess rifles, but in tube magazine guns in general, Remington UMC, or at the time, sorry, UMC, 4570 ammo had a tendency to detonate in the magazine tube. The shock from recoil or from cartridges being cycled from the magazine back into the lifter would cause one bullet to impact the primer in front of it and set off the cartridges. This did, in fact, cause problems for Winchester at the 1878 trials. So the right way to handle this would have been for Burgess to, say, include a note with the rifle specifying don't use UMC ammo, perhaps. Instead, they did nothing until rifles started blowing up in customers' hands, and then they retroactively tried to address it by having UMC produce a special version of their ammunition specifically for the Burgess rifle, which, to their credit, UMC did, but it was a little too late. Like, the cat was out of the bag. People already have, your rifle already has this reputation for, first off, jamming, and second off, exploding. And, you know, it's really hard to fight back from a reputation like that. And ultimately, they weren't able to. We'll talk about that in a minute. Now, they did resolve the issues with the problems of the elevator jamming. They did that, basically there are three versions of the Burgess. The second version is, there are only like 100 guns, and it's an interim thing that we're going to ignore. What we have here is a third pattern gun. Flip it over on this side. And this is our first pattern. So the external differences are relatively slim. You can see that one of this center action screw has been removed. Not entirely sure what it did, but they decided it was superfluous and got rid of it. And you can see that they changed the contour of the receiver, and they changed the design of the stock just slightly. Mostly just aesthetic changes, with the exception of the internal changes to the elevator to make the guns more reliable. If they had come out with this as the initial commercial version of the gun, the third pattern, if it had been first, the Burgess might have had a much more successful career in the open market. If you think about the competition, Winchester didn't have a rifle capable of handling 4570, a lever action, until 1886. There was a full 10 years or 8 years of opportunity that Burgess and Whitney could have taken advantage of with this rifle if they had done it just a little bit better. The sad thing is it's not even the rifle that's the problem. Like, once they got it finalized, this was a darn good rifle. Marlin would come out with a rifle in 1881, but using Burgess's patents, ironically. But even then, like, that's still 3 good years that they could have had to have a nice head start on Winchester with a very legitimate claim that, hey, Winchester is not strong enough, but the Burgess is. Now, there's one other element here that makes this particular rifle, or carbine, this is the third pattern military carbine, this is an exceptionally rare specimen, and that's because it has 2 barrel bands and a bayonet lug. The standard military carbine, despite the name military, didn't have a bayonet lug. It was a carbine. You didn't really need a bayonet. There are only, I believe, 4 known examples of military carbines with bayonet lugs, and only 2 of them are third pattern. So we actually even have the bayonet that goes on this, which is going to slip on very nicely right there, and that is super cool. There's nothing like a lever action repeating 4570 with a giant Yatagan saber bayonet on the end of it. So production of the Whitney-Burgess-Morse began in 1878 and it ended in March of 1880. It was a very short production run of these guns. Somewhere between 1,700 and 2,200 of them were made in total. That was it. After that, Whitney kind of cut his ties, cut his losses on this and moved on to the Whitney Kennedy rifles, which I do have a video on if you're interested. Burgess would similarly move on to work with other people. It's interesting that Burgess didn't grant an exclusive license to his patent. So even after this rifle was over and done with at Whitneyville, Burgess continued to license his patents to Whitneyville for use in the Whitney Kennedy rifles. He then also licensed them to Marlin for their model of 1881 lever action rifle, and he would go on to license them to Colt for the 1883 Colt Burgess. That is part and parcel of the famous gentleman's deal between Colt and Winchester over lever action rifles and revolvers. The guy who did the lever action work for Colt on that was Andrew Burgess. At any rate, Burgess would go on to have, well, a far more substantial and significant figure in small arms design than he's typically given credit for. People don't recognize his name nearly to the extent that they should. No. If you are a lever action collector or a Burgess fan and you're interested in either of these rifles or other Burgess guns in general, both of these and a whole bunch of others are going to be in this April premiere auction here at Rock Island. So you can take a look in their catalog, find the detailed pictures and descriptions of these two and everything else that's in there. Thanks for watching. Ho ho, you thought you were done with this, but you're not yet. One last thing we need to talk about here are the markings on this rifle. So on the upper tang, we have A. Burgess, that's Andrew Burgess, and his two most substantial patents, his 1873 and 1875 patent dates. That's fine. Interestingly, Whitneyville, or Whitney, is not marked anywhere on here, most likely because Eli Whitney kind of wanted to wait and see if the guns were successful before associating his name with them. On the top of the barrel, we have the caliber marking, which is 45 cal, 70 grains, center fire. And then we have a really interesting mystery, sort of. On the top of the barrel in front of the sight is marked G.W. Morse and a patent date from 1856. And you might wonder, if a patent was typically 14 or 17 years, why does an 1856 patent matter to an 1878 rifle? That's 22 years later, well beyond the expiration date of a patent. And the answer is nobody really knows for sure. Now, Morse had gone to work for the Confederacy during the Civil War and had a patent on breech-loading firearms and ammunition that he contended the Union government, the federal government, infringed on in building many of its breech-loading carbines during the war. And he sued the federal government for, I think, 130,000 instances of patent violation for carbine production. And this suit was still going on around the time that the Burgess rifles were going into production. So there are a couple speculated theories. One is that Morse may have financed the initial production of these guns as a way to bolster his case against the Union. One is that Whitney and or Burgess may have been concerned that maybe their rifle would infringe his patent, and if he won this case against the government, maybe he'd be able to come after them. And so it's speculated that either they agreed to license the patent from him or bought it outright, but no one's really sure because there's no documentation discussing this. But this, the fact that the marking is there, is why these guns are occasionally referred to, or often referred to, as the Whitney-Burgess-Morse. And the one last thing I want to mention, it looks like that marking has been polished down and the gun refinished. In reality, the fact of the matter is the way that Whitneyville produced these guns, they actually stamped the markings before they applied the finish. And in fact, before they gave it the final polish before applying the finish. So even on brand new production guns, these markings already have the appearance of having been polished down prior to finish because, in fact, they were polished down prior to being finished. So that's why they look that way. Don't let it fool you into thinking that a gun has been refinished. Obviously, no one's going to mistake this one for a refinished gun because it has no finish, really. It does have a really nice patina, though.